Okay, so let us begin right away. Let me take this opportunity to welcome you all to Dialogues. I'm very glad that we could start another round of dialogue so soon. In fact, I sincerely thank Professor Srinivas Reddy for agreeing to share facets of his newly published work with us. I shall not detain you with further details about the book, since I have mentioned those details in my mail and my several reminders to you. The book is a biography of the famous ruler of Vijayanagar, Krishnadevaraya. Before we begin, and before I ask Srini to begin the presentation, may I request you all to switch off your microphones and video so that we do not have a problem of bandwidth.
My pleasure. Thank you, Madhumita. And thank you everyone for joining. Speaking here is like speaking at home. So I'm just honored and so joyful to do this. And we were going to do this at home in India. But, unfortunately, all these things happen and we couldn't do that. But I'm glad that we can do this online, and I'm just so happy and thankful and grateful. And I just wanted to mention, everyone at IIT, like I said, it's a family. I mean, I'm still so deeply connected to everyone there. And the genesis of this book also began there. So I just wanted to mention, I think Professor Jain's like in a Senate meeting or something, but hopefully he'll come. He joined the class almost attended all the classes. So we had a wonderful class. So classical Indian literature, a lot of wonderful students interested in history. So all of this is wonderful. So I just wanted to thank Professor Jain for just all the love and support he's given to me over these years. And also Professor Danino, Michelle has just been a great friend and scholar and just taught me so many things. And I don't know if they're online now, but I asked them to join if they could. They're also early risers. It's early morning here. My teacher, mentor, my friend, my advisor, George Hart, and his wife, Kausalya Hart, were both my teachers and also supported everything that I did in my graduate work to write Amakamalyada, and then, which is really, RAYA, this new book is really a continuation of that. So anyway, I just wanted to say with deep gratitude to those four people, and also all of you, my friends and colleagues and teachers, namaste and thank you. So I will now try to share a screen and give a quick presentation. If you saw the presentation I gave in Bangalore, there'll be some repeats of the slides, but of course I'll try to talk about some different things. It's been really fun doing many events on the book because there's so many issues to talk about. And what I would actually like to do is I'll try to finish up rather quickly and have more time for question and answer, because I think the dialoguing could be good. So if you want to type a question in the chat, a clear, pointed question, please do that. That would be lovely. Okay, on that note, let me start the presentation. So thank you again. So the title of this particular presentation is India's First Global Leader, which is a phrase I use in the book, and a phrase that, I will try to justify it some measure throughout the talk. So to begin with, here is an image of the king. This is a statue that you can see today. This is right outside the main entrance to the Garbhagriha of Tirupati. So Raya, whose Ishtadevata was Venkateshwara, he visited Tirupati on 7 occasions, donated a lot of money and land to the temple, along with his 2 wives. His senior wife, Tirumala Devi, who had some very strong connections to the Tamil country, and then his second wife, Chinna Devi, who we do know about from the sources. The Portuguese mention her. She was a dancer girl, most likely of a lower caste. So not like an official political wife, but most certainly his beloved, like the one he loved. And you can also see the fact that she's here right beside him in the this iconography shows that she had quite a bit of status also in the political organization of what was going on. So one of the themes I've also been trying to present as I go along is that history, as we think of it today, is a Western idea for the most part. At least, I mean, the history is an English word. It has a connotation, a history to that word of history. And fundamentally, we have to understand that what we, from an Indian perspective, understand as history is very different from history in that typical Western sense that we think of it. And one of the points about that is in regard to basically our sense of time in India, is the idea that nothing really goes away, things stay on in some way, and history is something that just exists in the here and now. So as I'm saying, you can visit this temple, you can visit the great ruins of Hampi, which I will share now to give you a sense of the kind of livingness of it, even though it has a hauntingly beautiful quality because of the ruins that it's in. The kind of myth of Vijayanagar is based on that idea of something so glorious and wonderful, almost unbelievable, a dream, as Domingo Paes, the Portuguese horse trader, says. But it wasn't. And yet we have these ruins, and so you see the leftover, the remains of this thing, which give that kind of romantic quality to it all. And if you visit Hampi, you can really, really feel it. So let me proceed on now. This is an important thing. This is a beautiful map that my brother-in-law had made. We made together. Has some nice icons there. So we track both temples, forts, and large capital cities. So the main thing to get is, this is the slide of, time and space. So we're talking about 16th century South India. 1500 is a critical moment in world history. Just like they say 500 BC is an axial age, I also believe that 1500 is an axial age. Axial in the sense that there was, and I can talk about this later, a fundamental shift in epistemology that was really taking place at that point. The old Indian ways, were on a decline, really. And Raya represents, in that sense, a pinnacle of that Indian intellectual, cultural type of tradition, a certain type that certainly goes into a type of decline, you could say, after him. And that really has to do with, of course, the beginning of colonialism and the entrance of Western cultures and peoples. So we have now four main players that we'll have in our story. Vijayanagar, of course, the red star right on the banks of the Tungabhadra River, and which is a tributary of the Krishna. And so this area right between the Krishna and the Tungabhadra, that Doab, which you call that area, where you have the forts of Mudgal and Raichur, become a very contested area with the other main player in this zone, which is Bijapur. Often considered the great nemesis of Vijayanagar, which is true in many senses. They even have the same name. Vijayapura and Vijayanagara basically mean the same thing. But, as I argue in the book, Raya's biggest rival and his most hated nemesis was in fact the great Gajapatis of Orissa, who had conquered most of the western eastern coast, most of what we would call coastal Andhra at that time. And so most of Raya's campaigning was to regain that territory south of the Krishna, which had always been the kind of traditional border of the Vijayanagara Empire. So those are the three kind of, you could say, land powers involved. But here we now have, in 1498, of course, Vasco comes to Kerala. And then, within 12 years, the Portuguese have pretty much taken control of the entire Indian Ocean trade system by getting key ports and taking control of these critical places. One of them, of course, being Goa. So Goa then rises as a very important player in the early, what we would say, colonial period in India, which basically starts around this time. Okay, so here are a couple of shots from Vijayanagara, Hampi, we call today. It's beautiful. It's absolutely magical, spectacular place. The boulders, the architecture, and unlike other monuments of India, where you pay the ticket and you visit one thing and then you leave. Hampi is an entire landscape which one can explore almost like a hiking trip, and it's truly fantastic. And I would recommend everyone to visit this beautiful place. So here's a little excerpt. Madhumita wanted me to read from the book, which I'm happy to do from other parts. And I also wanted to maybe end later with a verse from Amukamayada, which is quite lovely. But here I'll just quote a passage from the book and introduce a couple of another important themes. So the realm that the upstart brothers, that is, the brothers I'm talking about now are Harihara and Bukkaraya, who are the founders of Vijayanagara, a couple of hundred years before Raya. So the realm that the upstart brothers had claimed for themselves was the mythical land of Kishkinda, ancient home of legendary monkey warriors of the Ramayana, like Vali, Sugriva, and Hanuman. There, across the arid plain, flows the river Pampa, or Tungabhadra, gently coursing its way through barren expanses and breathtaking clusters of gargantuan boulders that appear to float in the sky. Harihara and Bukka's vision for their new dominion wasn't something preconceived. It arose from the rugged terrain before them, just as the city they would go on to build would seem to magically emerge from the rocky landscape. So the main thing I wanted to stress here is that the founders of Vijayanagara were not some great kshatriyas, not some great lineage of Surya Vamsha or Chandra Vamsha kings, but they were also just like local Telugu warlord chief types, and so the whole thing, because this is a big point that I discuss in the book, and people try to make a big deal. Oh, Krishnadevaraya, this great king, was a Shudra, or he was a Dasiputra, and all of these things, which is fine. We can discuss that, but we have to put that into context, which is to say that nobody in this empire was of some royal blood, nor were many of the other empires around them, including even the Gajapatis, who really kind of lorded over Krishnadevaraya, the fact that they were great kings and he was just the Dasiputra. So anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that there was an amazing amount of social dynamism happening in India. I mean, from ancient times for sure, but very much increased during this medieval period. And so a lot of the kings of this time were not of this high-born lineage. Okay, this is one of my favorite photos. These are all my photos that I took on a trip just a couple of years ago. This is a beautiful one at the top of Hemakuta Hill. There's two main spiritual hills there, Hemakuta and Matanga hills. You can climb both of them and they're beautiful. But Hemakuta, this is looking down from the hill towards the Virupaksha main temple. And one thing that I like about this picture is it shows layers of the history of Vijayanagara. So, there's many things going on. Even before the founding of, Harihara and Bukka, there was sacred sites going on here along the river. And so you have, in the foreground, you have this, some quite old structures. And towards the left in the foreground, you can see some very, idiosyncratic type of, architecture on the shikaras there. And then in the background, you have the main Virupaksha temple, which is still a functioning temple. You can visit there. The temple elephant will bless you. It's a beautiful place. And of course, even on that temple, you can see the different layers of structures, the Gopuram, of course, being much newer, and Krishnadevaraya himself donning a mandapam, which can still be visited. So this is just some examples of the kind of richness of Hampi as it is today. Okay, now coming to the king, finally. This is again the bronze that's at Tirupati. And as I like to say, you're not like a bona fide great Indian until you get a stamp. And so here it is. Raya gets his stamp in 2011. And in the background, you have all sorts of nice stuff from Hampi, Vijayanagara. So I will actually talk about some of those stela very specifically. You can see in the background some dancing girls. I'll show you some fine reliefs of those. Okay, so to get back to the global leader part, I mean, again, one of the key things that's happening at this time is the beginning of a maritime global enterprise that takes now into account Europe, Africa, and Asia. And I mean, Asia all the way going to Japan, Asia, because the Portuguese go all the way there eventually. And then, of course, the Spanish, as the Portuguese and Spanish made a deal that, we'll take everything east of this line, and the Treaty of Tordesillas, I think, I forget what year, but, then the Spanish, of course, took everything to the west. And so this is how the kind of world was divided in that colonial mind as Europe made their way across the globe. The critical thing at this point with the Portuguese and the trade was the war horse. And this is a subject that I've written about in a recent anthropology paper, so if you'd like to know more about it, you can look into it. And since Michel is here, I have to say, I also quoted him a couple of times on this issue also. And there's a lot of information about the horse, and if you want more, Michel will give you plenty to read. But what I discovered kind of towards the end of doing some of that research and integrating it with what I was reading from RAYA and other sources of the period was that certainly there was a horse-like, type of a horse, basically a horse. There was a horse in India from a long time ago, but it wasn't the kind of horse that was good for like battle. And so war horse of that stocky Central Asian breed, that style of horse was the key thing. It was like tanks or nuclear weapons of the age. It's like whoever had the horses won. So every empire just wanted to get the horses. And by 1510, Albuquerque has taken complete control of Goa, and he has control of all horse trading, basically, that's going into southern India. So here, again, an example of how history works in India is this is a poem, from Amuklamali. This is not, generally considered a historical source, but certainly in my reading of literature and my use of sources to write the book, literature is essential. And literature, particularly from the RAYA himself, this is basically an autobiography in a sense, is essential and invaluable, really, in the reconstruction of this person's life. So I'll read you this verse, which mentions the horses and also mentions all the places geographically where they're coming from. Soldiers need 2 stirrups to mount their tall stallions. And I won't get into the metaphor here because it does take a little bit of explaining. But the point is that, these horse riders are really small and these horses are really big. And this is just an example of the high level of metaphoric imagination that a true kavi needs in the Indian tradition. So anyway, soldiers need 2 stirrups to mount their tall stallions. But as the horses gallop and begin to crouch, their riders become scared as their feet graze the ground. But which of these 2 is worse? And what will become of us? Think the proud warriors as they feign exhaustion, humbled twice over by these mighty swift steeds from Persia, Balkh, Herat, and Khotan. I mean, and it's very accurate. Those are exactly the places where a lot of these horses, there were a lot of that horse trade was funneling into Hormuz, which is again another key port that Albuquerque had taken. And then those horses were directly all coming to Goa. And then it was a bidding war between Bijapur and Vijayanagara that the Portuguese exploited to their advantage. And here, this is the Vittala temple, reliefs from the Vittala temple. And if you look carefully, the dress, the look, the beard, the hats, these are very, maybe not the bottom one, but the top one and the bottom right, very clearly, I think, Portuguese with their horses. So again, some more verses from Amuklamali. This is from the Rajaniti section, a whole 80 verses written by RAYA on statecraft. And here, explicit mention of merchants from distant lands, i.e. the Portuguese. So promote trade by providing for ports and encouraging the sale of horses, wild elephants, jewels, perfume, pearls, and more. Merchants from distant lands who import elephants and war horses should be kept in imperial service at the capital. Treat them with prestige and provide them with towns and mansions. And if you read the book, you'll find that this is exactly what happened. There's a beautiful scene when Paez and his whole group of musketeers are invited to Vijayanagara. They come for Navaratri time. They have a grand old time and are wined and dined. It's quite a lovely scene, and really it cements the historical fact that the Portuguese-Vijayanagar relationship was essential in securing the empire. Okay, and here again, we're at Vijayanagara. You can see the Gajashala, where the elephants would be kept and trained. There's a training area to the side. And right across from there, or very close by, you can see the image on the bottom left and then a close-up on the bottom right. This is what's known as the Lotus Mahal, maybe quarters for the queens and her attendants. And the reason I'm just bringing this up is another major theme, which we can get into, and I can read maybe a section because I did take time to write very carefully about this issue, is the nature of Hindu-Muslim relationships during this time. And when we look at the history, when we look at the architecture, when we look at the political language, what we find is that there was a great amount of synergy going on between indigenous Indian practices and heavily Persianized practices that were being imported by the sultans of Bijapur and other Bahmani sultans, and even, of course, the Delhi Sultan as well, because Persian was really the high language. It was the classical, language of prestige. And so, that fusion, that Indo-Persian fusion that happened in the Deccan is unique, and it was not something that was not felt in Vijayanagara. So on many levels, and even if you look at that statue carefully, that statue, which is in Tirupati, he's not wearing a turban, as you see many modern depictions, but he's wearing this canonical hat, which Professor Wagner has done some fantastic research. One can read his paper, Sultan Amongst Hindu Kings. Highly recommend that. So my point is simply to say that there was a lot of interaction, and just so I can be clear about this, very clear, and I could read out the section of the book maybe later if people want to know more specifics, but the bottom line is Vijayanagara history, or what we call historiography, that is the history of history, has been basically presented as Vijayanagara, the bastion of Hindu culture, the last bastion of Hindu culture, against the onslaught and domination of the sultans and Islam, which is just simply not the case at all if you look at the history. Certainly there was religious difference, certainly there was some religious antagonism, but whether or not the politics of the time played out on those lines, I don't think really it bears out when we read the evidence. And again, I can speak more about this later, but again, my point is simply to stress that there was a lot more cultural interaction, particularly in the political sphere, and again, in the architectural sphere, you can see nicely as well, that was going on between these cultures and these governments and these empires at that time. Here's a couple of other examples, nice close-ups. And again, this is not, you can't call this Hindu style, you can't call this Islamic, you can't, so now scholars, they call it like Deccanese style, which is in many ways true. The Deccan was just an incredible place of dynamic cultural interaction. Okay, so here, so just some examples of the kind of glory of this empire. And these are all images, places that you can go and see today. And the stone itself, as I read in the quote, these are all stone quarried from nearby. In some cases not, actually. There's a couple areas where stones were brought in, but there's a sense when you visit Vijayanagara that you're in the past right now, but you're still totally here in a way that summarizes what Vijayanagara has come to be, I think, in that historical imagination. And, in that way of the India that was, the wonder that was, the glory that was. But I don't believe that. I believe It's the glory that is and that can be, because these things are here, but we need to preserve them. These things are here, but we need to research them. These things are here, but we need to, give our attention to them and value them the way that, a lot of people in other parts of the world value them. So again, just I really recommend spending time, if you can get a vacation, to go to Hampi. Here now, as I was mentioning, the more close-ups, and you can see just the kind of thing that would happen. For example, I do a whole section on the Navaratri. Navaratri was a fascinating time because this was a time when is there some sound there that's coming? Okay. Can you hear okay, everyone? Hello?
I can't hear anything, Srini, except what you're saying. You mean
Okay.
some sound? Okay.
Yeah, if you can hear me, that's fine.
Yeah.
Okay. So the Navaratri Festival was a very interesting time because, of course, it was a religious ceremony. Of course, it was a festive time for celebration. But more importantly, this was the time annually when all the lords would gather with their troops to celebrate, to take stock of the kind of fighting force, and critically, this is when the salaries would be meted out. And so there was a whole financial, military, religious, political combination happening at this time. And these friezes just show that so beautifully. You have the elephants, and you have horses, then you have the soldiers, then you have the dancing girls on the top, and a close-up of the dancing girls. Again, on the right, you have hunters, you have camels there, horses, elephants. So what they write about is what you can see today. That's kind of what I'm saying. It's not this imagination, even though Pius himself says, no one will believe me when I write this all down. And it's become like that. And just one other thing, again, this is another huge discussion which we can have about language, the fact that RAYA wrote in Telugu, the fact that he was Tulu, the fact that, well, many other issues about that. But on the upper right here, you can see there's an inscription there right in Devanagari script, and then right above there's Kannada script. So this kind of multilingualism in, of course, speech, but also even in Lipi. As I mentioned, the Tirupati inscriptions are often done in 3 languages, Telugu, Tamil, and Sanskrit. So the language at this moment is also fascinating in the sense that this is now past the point of the original kind of vernacular or moment of India around 1000, when these languages like Telugu and Kannada started coming up as languages. This is when those languages reach a huge maturity point, 500 or so years later. So Raya, in that sense, represents a true apex, in so many aspects, literary, political, social, in the sense of his own background. So in many ways, that kind of pinnacle moment. But then the sad thing about pinnacles and apexes is that everything goes downhill from there. Not to make it sound bad, but Vijayanagara is a smoldering ruin, in basically one lifetime after Raya. So it's a lot happens. Of course, Vijayanagar does continue, and maybe there'll be a sequel to the book. I'm thinking about that because there's a very interesting history that I also don't know about, the whole Aravidu dynasty and how that leads into the whole Nayaka period later. So very interesting stuff. Oh, okay. Let me read one poem first, and I'll explain this photo, and then I can stop. I'll read now one just small section from Amuktamalila, actually. This is a beautiful verse. The king is actually describing the king of Madurai, But of course, it's very obvious that this is probably autobiographical. Certainly, the purport of the story is such, and I'll read it in full because I think one of the main points of this global leadership, this leadership in general, especially now when we think about what leadership means. I said this in an interview the other day, but the key thing is you need leaders who think. You need leaders who have a philosophy behind their actions that is bigger than themselves or parties or other agendas, and it has to be about people. Um, so the idea of like what we would call the philosopher king, that's an old idea. When I think of like people like like Marcus Aurelius, who I was reading the other day, his Meditations, and a beautiful book. Anyone has time to read that, you should read that. I mean, great leaders, truly great leaders, with vision and that philosophy. And Raya had that, and I think that's what made him truly great. And I think he arrived at that philosophy through his life experience. And I think he encoded some of that in this small passage in that he writes in Amuktamayala, which I'll describe now. It starts with the king in his most royal attire going out to meet a concubine in some small lane in the the hidden district in the city somewhere. And we do have a lot of stories about, of course, Raya disguising himself and disappearing into the city streets. So here we go. A section from Amuktamayala about how the great king, with all his finery, turns his mind to philosophy. Smeared with a mixture of deer musk and rosewater, the fine perfume alone announced his royal presence. Bees, attracted by the fragrance of flowers, were swatted away by his turban tassels that swung in the breeze scented with patala blossoms. His swaying pearl earrings appeared to taunt the shiny pearl necklace that swung to his ears, and the moonlight reflected on his red silk sash, where his hand held the hilt of his well-honed sword. Guards cleared a path in front of him, and a lady carried a box filled with betel nut, as the king, like a moving Mount Meru, strode into an inner lane within the inner quarters to meet a waiting lover. On his way, he overheard a visiting Brahmin recite a wise saying. Just as you should gather provisions for the rainy season in the 8 months before the monsoon, you should prepare for night during the day, for old age when still young, and for the next life right now in this life. While you still can, you should try your very best to lead a righteous life. These words about life's inevitable future pierced the king's soul. The king listened to the proverb, reflected on it in his heart, understood its meaning, and stopped. He was stunned, overwhelmed, and petrified by his self-perpetuated delusions. He froze and stood in the middle of the road in utter distress. And he thought to himself, "Oh, what is this glorious empire? What are these pleasures? Why do we have these emotions? This body is nothing but a bubble about to burst. Even Manu, the primal man who was born at the dawn of time, was ultimately destroyed, trampled by the great god of death. I've enjoyed this life without ever considering the path to freedom. But have I ever really lived? Just as travelers are ferried to the far shore without even noticing the movements of the boat, so too does time pass quickly without our realizing it. And in this trance, life just passes us by. The joys of an empire are as fleeting as lightning, and I can't go through life addicted to sensual enjoyments, as if I was strolling through some kind of pleasure garden. From this moment on, I shall seek only spiritual happiness." And I could go on, but just even reading it again makes me feel like how much any author any writer, any creator of any kind, any producer, any artist, whatever, even scientific paper, anything you create, you put so much of yourself into that. Creation is a reflection of the author. So I really worked hard on the book for many years and to try to say things the best way and the balanced way that I could. And again, I'm just so grateful that it came out the way it did. So one of the things, so the first slide, I always wanted to be the cover, which they made the cover. And then when we were getting towards the end of the book, the publishing part, I emailed and said, so, you agreed to this front cover, but what's the back cover going to be? And they said, oh, we'll probably just put the same image on the back. And I was like, that's not right. There's only one Raya image, that's it. And then the back has to be something nice and something special. And they said, oh, yeah, well, maybe we'll look into it. And maybe there's some pictures of Vijayanagara we could put. And so then I was like looking for some pictures. And then I saw this wonderful book. If you get to see this book, I think it's in the library. I think it's called City of Vijayanagara. But anyway, John Gollings is this Australian photographer, and he's taken some beautiful photos of Vijayanagara. And so I found this one that I really liked. And anyway, I sent it to the editor and I said, I'd love to use this. This captures something for me. And he was like, oh no, he's a very famous guy and it costs a lot of money to get rights for you have to go find like a free image like on Google or something. I was like, So I wrote to John Gollings. And I wrote him a very heartfelt letter just saying how much I loved his work. And, and then you speak to an artist again, specifically say, I like this image because of this. And I told him that I like this image because I felt like it captured something about Vijayanagara. The fact that, there are cow herds that are, buffalo herd are still there. People are living there. This is not dead at all. Those ruins are, they're real. Those temples are still being worshipped today. People still go there. And there was something about Raya, I also talk about it in the book, this whole symbiosis between king and people. Yata Raja Tata Prajaha. That was, it was a glorious place because he had a glorious leader, who could steer things in the right way. And I just love this image because, it captures all those feelings. You get the boulders, you have the beautiful column work, the buffaloes, and then the kind of random guys in the back. It's just lovely. So I really recommend a trip to Vijayanagar. I was very grateful that Will Dalrymple, really liked the book and wrote a blurb and recommended that people read Raya before going there. So yeah, hopefully you can read it and go to Vijayanagara and learn more about Indian history. That's my wish. And thank you very much, everyone. Love you so much. And that's it. I'm happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you so much, Srini, for this fascinating talk. I must, also for, ending it close to 5:42 as you had promised to do. I think that leaves us some time for question and answer. Before we, sort of request the others to come in with their questions, I have a couple myself. So I think I'll, take the opportunity to ask you, because one thing that I must confess to my to the other listeners is that I have one advantage over the other listeners. I've read the entire book because you were so kind to share the PDF with me. So so I must say that I'm quite moved by your empathy with Raya as a subject, and I almost envy your sentiments that all historians somehow or the other aim to feel for the subject. I must also say that I was left quite breathless by the sheer and steady pace as you move from one landmark in his life to the other, ending with the ruler's tragic misunderstanding with Timarasu, the loving minister who had raised Raya to the throne. I could see traces of statecraft, relations with the Nayakas.
Madhumita.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I just got cut off, so I didn't hear anything that you were saying. I'm sorry.
Okay. So okay, fine. I said I was quite, I must congratulate you on this fascinating work. And I have one advantage. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. So one advantage that I have is that I have read the entire book because you were so kind to share the PDF with me, and therefore, I know all that you have written about Raya, and my questions come from there, and my appreciation of the book and of what you have written also from reading the entire book. So I was trying to say that it is the pace at which you write, the sheer and steady pace as you move from one landmark in the life of the monarch to the other, ending with the misunderstanding with Timarasu, the loving minister who raised Raya to the throne. It left me quite breathless. And there were so many traces that you did not speak about in today's lecture, but are there in the book, and I'm sure anybody who reads it will be able to see how you talk about statecraft, the relations with the Nayakas, the relations with the Gajapati rulers, Adil Shah, Ismail Adil Shah, and so on. So I think I recommend the book to everybody. I think it's quite fascinating. We know many of these things, but your retelling of the story is quite fascinating. So having congratulated you on this fascinating work, I would like to address some questions based on my reading. Shall I, Srini?
Yeah. I mean, please go ahead.
Okay. So one question that I had, the first one is that is about your approach, objectives, and methodology. And one question that I had was, why did you feel compelled to compare Raya with a global ruler? Why do you call him a global ruler? And how do you really justify this point? I can understand the bit about an ideal ruler, but why a global ruler? And so far as the Philosopher King is concerned, and you just mentioned Marcus Aurelius and Stoicism, in fact, on the contrary, Raya seems to have been quite a volatile personality, a very ambitious monarch, eaten by vanity, driven by anxiety, and easily crossed either by a queen or an enemy. Now, pardon my saying that. I'm quite in love with Krishnadevaraya myself, but I cannot help but address this question to you. I know that you admit that he was an imperfect human being, and towards the end of your book, you mentioned this. But you also talk about the Parijata Apaharanamu, for instance, the play written by Timanna, which is in order to teach Krishnadevaraya how to win back an irate queen. And I'm also reminded of how he banished Annapurna Devi, the Gajapati princess. All this somehow or the other seemed to me to be the expression of very volatile sort of temperament, and I found it a little unsettling. And although you say that he was, after all, an imperfect human being, I could see that you are not totally convinced by your confession. This is one question I had about the global beat. Shall I ask you all the questions together? Maybe you can sort of answer them as you deem fit. Srini?
I think that was enough.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
I think that was good now.
That was good enough?
Well, I think there were multiple questions there, I think also.
Yeah.
So.
I think just one or two more so that you can take them all together. The second is what you compare him with Alexander when it comes to cutting the Gordian knot, about how he cut off the fingers, his father's fingers, in order to take up the signet ring. So I was wondering, what could have impelled you to place this incident, because this seems to be so much shrouded in myths. So this is the second one. The third is about the communal politics bit, where you say that, the attempts by modern scholars like Philip Wagner, Richard Eaton, and others to say that this was not really a Hindu kingdom, so to speak, but there was a fusion of so many different elements. And then you go on to talk about how this analytical model is helpful. And this is in pages 57 and 58, where you say say that although this analytical model is helpful in reformulating and enriching our understanding, but perhaps the corrective has swung the pendulum too far. One is sometimes left with the feeling that religion had no role to play in the political life of pre-modern India. And I quote you here. So I was wondering why you felt the need to talk about communal politics. For instance, there is this incident about Shah Muhammad marrying the Vijayanagar princess, which is way before Akbar married Jodha. So why not make much of that incident rather than talk about how religion was politicized? So, and this is the second question I have, and the third is about your sources and the relation with the Nayakas parceling out of sovereignty and all that, Vyasatirtha and the monasteries. What kind of a state do we have here? Because and what kind of, so you seem to base yourself on charitras and on plays and the Raya Vachakamu, for instance. What about the South Indian inscriptions, the land inscriptions, which tell us that sovereignty was, the Nayakas were very powerful, for instance, rather than just Domingo Pays and Farnau Nunes and Tariq Ferishta, which seem to be your principal sources. Did you also, for instance, think about looking at the land inscriptions, which could have told us a little more about the nature of the state, which has been so much a subject of debate, with Burtonstein and others. So these are more or less, I have a couple more, but I could ask them later on. So that is all. Sorry about it if it was too long. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Madhumita. I will try to answer all of those questions. I'd also like to take some questions from everyone that's gathered. And I lost the chat from when I got disconnected. So if you wrote a question in the chat earlier, I'm sorry I didn't see that. If you want to retype it, please feel free to do that. And I see that Professor Jain has joined, and I just want to say my very heartfelt namaskaram and thank you. I don't know if you heard what I said before, but you have been my champion and supported me through so many things, boss. Like, just love you, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart for making this happen. And I don't know if George is there, but I feel the same way about George. Okay, so the questions, I'll try my best. Global leader, well, I thought I tried to address that in the presentation. I think the main thing was that this was a point when India was coming into contact with Western powers and was getting connected through these maritime trade networks, at least in this early period, primarily through those ways, through to this larger network that was bringing in all sorts of different people and cultures. And since he was negotiating with, Portuguese friars and ambassadors and Bijapur sultans and Tamil kings and Gajapati kings, for me, that's the beginning of a kind of global politics, and again, a fundamental transformation in the world. I mean, the 1500 is the beginning of like this whole westernized industrial complex that we're in now, and that the whole coronavirus is making us question so deeply. And you can see it even in Raya. He like sends us into that, the opulence, the splendor, it's too much. And then I think in the poem I read there, I think he was in many ways dealing with that. Like he was a very kind of crazy manic guy, you could say, fun loving, great battlefield, but wonderful splendor. But then he had this kind of pull, being like, I got to do something right. I have to calm down. I have to, take up more spiritual matters. And so there was always that tug. There's even that famous line that when Timurasu wanted to put him on the throne, he said, no, I want to live my life as a yogi. That's all I want to do. I think he just wanted to play music. He was a Veena player and be with his Chinna Devi, the dancer, and not be involved in politics. And then when he got thrust into it, then it kind of like took over, and I think he just rolled with it. So certainly there was this volatility in him. I would not disagree, but as there was in Alexander, that's how these great kings are. They're mythic. Aurelius is a good example of the more calm, the Pax Romana type of king. And I mentioned him more on the philosophical side. But when I compare Raya to other kings, it's like Alexander who I compare him to, because they're not just kings, they're myth kings. Like today, Krishnadevaraya is not just a king. I'm actually trying to bring forth a little bit more of the king in a sense, but for most people, he's really just a myth. He's the guy that had this wonderful empire. He's this guy that joked around with Tenali Rama. So I want to do, in a sense, you could say, bring in that historical element, which I did. Now, and this gets to maybe some of your other question is, what is history again? And this is what I started the talk with from the hardcore academic perspective. And you can read the very interesting review actually written in the, I forget, it was like the Asian Book Review or something. A very interesting guy. Didn't get much press, but it was a very interesting review. This guy read the book carefully and classified it as fiction. He didn't even read it as a historical document because he said, I was quoting from the king's dream written in a poem written by the king. I mean, this clearly is a man who's in the old school camp of history that can't even see that a piece of poetry is in of itself a historical document. So, there's a shift in the way that history is being written and told. I mean, as you well know, Madhumita, and many others do. So, advancing things like myth, thinking that myth is not part of history, is simply, I think, like not a holistic picture of what history really means, in the sense of how does it affect the human being? How is the consciousness of this? What is it doing to us? So I think those are all some of the things. The communal politics part, you nailed the critical line, as any good history scholar would, because that is the line where I critique these guys who I think are really the great guys. And what I'm doing there, and I'll be very frank, when you look at places like Brown University, places like, Harvard's, places like Ashoka, places like what IAT Humanities wants to be. The model of our scholarship is based on, right now, that neoliberal Western Ivy League college standard. We read those authors, they're our theoretical base, our whole understanding of history is that. Now we're at a point where we're questioning that, and it's good, but we're still trapped with those same people in the same dialogue and in the same language. We have actually not broken out of any historical consciousness from our colonial past at all. At all. Because you look at what's being lauded in the world, that's what's going on. So that's one point. Now, the basic premise, the thing that you have to say when you're in these environments is Hindu-Muslim unity. There was no communal interference at all. People loved each other. It was wonderful. And all of this was a colonial construction. Now, I know people have critiqued that too, and they're getting there. But at a fundamental level, it's, you can't go from saying, Hindu empire against Muslim domination to there was nothing at all, going on at this period except two separate cultures with no, recourse to religion in their political life. You can't separate. The terminology is used, and this is how, again, academic use of history and language works. The terminology they use is Islamic means stuff related to Islam as a religion, but Islamicate means stuff related to Islam as a culture. So Vijayanagar is an Islamicate state in the sense that there was court dress that was Persian, there was language used that was Persian, et cetera, et cetera. There was architecture, okay. But there was nothing about the religion that was involved. Now, the biggest problem with that formulation, again, and I write this as clearly as I can without being too critical and wanting to have a good dialogue on this, is that again brings us back to the fundamental flaw of the Western epistemology. It's this constant desire to separate out religion from life, church and state. The problem that Indian historians are facing is they need to decolonize their language of discourse. If you go on talking about secularism, all you're really talking about is religious communalism. What you need to be talking about is dynamism, interaction, narratives, poetry. This is how Indian history lives. So this is an important point on the communal. About the Nayakas, that's a huge other subject. It's a large area, which, you know, I did some research on, of course, used some inscriptions. I've referred to many of those scholars who've done much more research. But that's not a large field that I wanted to discuss in this book. Primarily, my work was, reconstructing the biography of a single individual. So that was the main aspect. There's a lot of important work going into that, or has gone into. I don't know who's really working on that stuff right now. But again, like I said, there's all this interesting history post Vijayanagara. You know, you think after Battle of Talikota finished, it's all done, but no. You know, the ashes of Vijayanagara are burning, and the capital moves to Chandragiri, to Penikunda, moves south, and then later on, Tanjavur happens. And Tanjavur is a place where they're, again, still looking at Raya as the myth of like the great king. They're still patronizing Telugu literature. You know, it's very, very interesting stuff. Michelle has a question. Yes, Michelle.
Srini, so first of all, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
And I have to say again, the great namaste to Michelle, who's he's in the book, and beautiful.
I got this today morning. So this is the book, and I'm so much looking forward to reading it. I've read the prologue and the initial notes. You know that I was a fan of your translation of Amukta Malyada, and this is really the same atmosphere somewhere, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's a beautiful work, just dipping into a few pages randomly. I just want to quickly have two remarks, because maybe some students would like to ask questions. Two remarks and a mischievous little questions, if I may provoke you. You know that I love to provoke you.
Yeah.
My remark, number one, is you're doing a grave injustice comparing Krishnadevaraya to Alexander the Great, because they can't be compared. You know, Alexander the Great took pride in putting entire cities to the sword. I don't think there's any possible comparison. Anyway, it's just a minor point. Second, more important point is I fully...
to read the book.
All right, I will. I'll get back to you on this. The second is I am fully behind you when you say that, you know, that myth, in the true sense of the term, of course, is an integral part of history and should not be separated. In fact, I want to remind you that the British anthropologist Edmund Leach, maybe the tallest British anthropologist of the 20th century, declared that, in a sense, all history is myth. He didn't mean it's false. He means that it's a construct. You keep constructing new myths. That's all. That's all you do. So I'm totally at one with you on this. Okay, my mischievous question. In the abstract of the talk today, you wrote, Krishnadevaraya himself was a faithful Hindu, a devout Sri Vaishnava to boot, but he adopted an overarching state policy of religious tolerance. Why do you say but? Why not therefore he adopted an overarching policy of religious tolerance? Why this but? Why is this but butting in? That's my mischievous question. I'm done, Srini. Wonderful. Congratulations and all the best.
I mean, this is why I love Michelle. You nailed the point that I'm trying to make. See, I was stuck in that colonial but. No pun intended.
Yeah. So I object to you, but it should have been therefore.
You're right, Bob.
It would have done greater justice. I'm not saying that it is uniform across all Indian history. Of course, we can here and there pinpoint a few examples of actual intolerance, but it's the exception to the rule, right?
Thank you. Right.
Thank you,
Great
Srini.
question, great comment.
I'll get back and I'll bug you after reading the book.
Great. So we could have some other questions now. Thank you so much, Michelle. Professor Jain, you have any question? Turn your mic on, sir.
I joined late. I got stuck in a meeting, but I heard your comments and arguments very much, and I wish I could have joined in time, but I will hope that there is a recording that I will be able to go through it later. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
We could have some more questions from the listeners. Is there anybody who wishes to ask something? Okay. So, since there are nobody is ready with the question yet, Srini, I would like to use for some more time.
Okay.
The opportunity. I was just wondering about your this whole incident about how Prataprudradeva Gajapati was was mortified that he was getting beaten by this Dasiputra. Clearly, right? And Krishnadevaraya was a man who had made himself highly erudite, extremely brave warrior, and all that. It's quite fascinating. But I was just wondering, the fact that there is this disdain at a personal level, you seem to get under the skin and are able to make out that there is this whole cultural hiatus between the two rulers, and that there is this disdain that drives the animosity, at least so far as the Gajapati ruler is concerned. Now, what makes you think that Prataprudra Deva was thinking about Krishnadevaraya at a personal level at all? What evidence do you have to deduce that there was this aspect to the military, otherwise predominantly military interaction? So this is one thing I was curious about, if I may say so.
Yeah, so this is a perfect example of how I had to tell the story, because we don't have explicit information like that that says, there's no like a written inscription or something that says the Gajapati called him a Dasiputra. But we have stuff in the chronicles, we have verses from Amukamaya that show at least the Vijayanagar position on what they felt of the Gajapatis. And through some reconstruction, I think it's pretty clear. In addition to, a lot of that section is also heightened by just the oral tradition. There's a whole set of oral tradition about the Gajapati and his daughter and the marriage, like I mentioned in the book. And then this was again in terms of historiography, in terms of all of this stuff, Indian films, especially in Telugu, 50s and 60s, historical, Pauranika, mythological films in Telugu were absolutely number one in the film industry. And so, they made lots of films, and they made one movie called Mahamantri Timarasu, which one of the big themes in that book is this antagonism. So I definitely draw on all of that stuff to build the argument. So it's based on some historical, what we would call the hard facts from the historical perspective, but it uses all this other information too.
No, but you probably take it, I can see the page 98 I had noted down, where you say that Krishnadevaraya's imminent victory over the Gajapati, and I quote you here, would garner him the title of Gajapati Gajakuta Pakala, a fever upon the Gajapati's troops of elephants. Sadly, however, almost all sources from Orissa are curiously silent. That is probably something that sort of led you on in a direction like this. I just thought it could be one of it. But here I think Ankita has some question from you.
Okay.
I can see that. Ankita, would you like to ask your question? She has something about the language, I think. Ankita?
I wanted to know how is the state of language political. Is that it, Ankita?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Ankita, nice to have you. Well, I do a whole thing on this. Probably the most famous verse, or famous line actually, that people often quote in Telugu is, Is Sriram still around? We can ask him. Desha Bhasha Landu Telugu Lessa, which means amongst the regional languages, amongst the Desha Bhasha, Telugu is the best. So this line has been picked up. This line was picked up post-independence. Andhra was the oddly enough, Telugu people don't care so much about Telugu, but Andhra was the place where, language-based states developed. It's a very interesting kind of twist in the, but we can get into that later. My point is simply that this has become a slogan of Telugu pride. And something that people have interpreted from a linguistic perspective, particularly, that this was the mother tongue, this was the great language that of all this literature, blah, 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 blah. Not blah, blah, blah. I didn't mean that in a bad way. Just they go on like that. That's fine. But what these guys don't do is tell you the line that came before this line. Okay, so this is actually a line from Amuktamaya where this line appears, Desha Bhasha Landa Telugu Lessa. And by the way, just to add another level of complication, this line itself is not Raya's original line. This line must have been in circulation and was used in another text called Kridabiramamu about, what town is that about? I forgot. Warangal, I think. Yeah. Anyway, it's an earlier text, and it uses this line, and its previous line is saying something like, even though, I forget what it is, like Sakala Bhasha Samskriti Janani, like, Sanskrit is the mother of all languages, but amongst the regional languages, Telugu is the best. It comes like that. There's actually a lot more to a pun. You can read my paper. I wrote all about it on that issue. The point is simply that line gets reused by Raya in this line, but when Raya uses it, the previous line Raya uses is, this is key, Ella Nurpulu Kolovan Erugave Basadi. Okay, so I'll explain. Ella, all, Nurpulu, kings, Kolovan, Kolu. Kolu is a very interesting word. Golu, you find in Tamil. This is Kolu. Kolu actually means the Sabha, the gathering, when people have gathered for discussion. So, Ella Nurpulu Kolovan. At the time when all your kings have gathered, means all your lords have gathered. Then he says, Erigave Basadi. Basadi, Matladi. After you spoke with all those guys, Erigave, didn't you realize? Telugu is the best of the real. Means what? This was the language of his lords. This was the language of his administrators. If he was going to get in with these guys, be tight with them, he needed to speak this language. It was a political choice. It was not about language as a literary thing. He was patronizing Kannada. He was patronizing Tamil. He was patronizing Sanskrit. He was writing in Sanskrit himself. He also wrote in Telugu. Okay, fine. That just happened to be what was kind of dominant at that time. But the language choice in that sense is really a political choice. Basically, the main point is those Nayakas that Madhumita is kind of talking about, the earlier ones, the post-Kakatiya Nayakas, you could say, or Doras, in Telugu we say lords, that basically became the main guys of Vijayanagar. In fact, Harihara and Bukka kind of basically come down from there. All of those guys, non-Shudra, Telugu-speaking chiefs, that in this kind of volatile frontier dynamic culture of the Deccan rise up, and then some of them are little sprouts and then they die off. Some rise and become Vijayanagara, So like that, it was a politically expedient language for the time. That is the key answer and why I say that it's political. Thank you for excellent question.
Thank you, sir.
Wonder if there are others who would like to ask questions. No, none from my humanities and social sciences colleagues and students. I don't see other questions here. So let me just, as a sort of in response to your response to Ankita, I was just reminded of Lisa Mitchell's work and how Telugu becomes the mother tongue. I just thought of mentioning that, probably you are taking the date back far into the 16th century, and Lisa Mitchell is only trying to talk about the 19th century when Telugu really becomes a language of politics, language of identity, and a language of belonging. It's a very interesting conversation that you could have there with Lisa Mitchell, probably on the question of when Telugu really becomes a language of belonging. From what you say, it seems that it was already to Krishnadevaraya, a language that he was choosing for all kinds of political reasons. So this is just a comment, not really a question. If there are other questions, yes, Srini?
Yeah. Well, I can comment on that comment, and then Amita has a question, so then I can take that. So on that point, Madhumita, I mean, since you're a historian, you will appreciate these things. You see, well, I don't want to get political, but the point is that, again, the dominant theory has always been that political languages, regional political languages in India, was like kind of, again, a modern thing, that, 19th century-ish time. But like back in the day, there was no sense of like, I'm a Bengali or I'm an Andhra or a Tamil or something like that. Now, all of that, is up for discussion. But to say that the language was not political at that time is simply an axiom that needs correction. So that is why I said it. And in defense of Lisa Mitchell, who I met, we had finally had a Telugu conference. I didn't get to talk to her about this stuff, but she tracks this stuff from the beginning. So she goes all the way from Sanskritam and Prakrit and that evolution. What is Tatsama? What is Tadbhava? How do languages evolve? How do terms evolve? So she tracks all that. But she's still relying on certain axioms that have been put in place in South Asian studies history, I feel like, that need some reconsidering. Yeah. So Amita, how closely involved was Krishnadevaraya involved in patronizing architecture?
Yes, I very much look forward to reading your book, and I feel the architectural splendor of Vijayanagar is very closely related to landscape. The vocabularies used are not exclusive to Vijayanagar, but I was wondering how did this come about? This architectural splendor come about? Did the king, especially Krishnadevaraya, have a very close hand in determining, the architectural form, the sheer magnificence of sculptural details?
I don't know how personally involved he was. There might be more. There's a whole set of scholars, by the way, that have done incredibly wonderful work on Vijayanagar architecture, including, this Gollings did a bunch of pictures to go along with George Mitchell.
Yes.
I'm not getting the name right now. Filiozat also did great work. I mean, there's a constellation of those scholars that the architecture work. So I did not even venture into that world to get in there. What I do know though is, and I mentioned a couple of places, RAYA definitely did a lot of building, and building was an important part of the whole being of kingship. So and particularly, even that mandapam that I mentioned, that where he gets coronated, he adds to that. He sponsors temple construction. He builds stuff at the whole Bhuvana Vijayam, that famous site. I mean, Pedana even quotes it, and then Pius mentions it in the Chronicles. He builds this great thing after the Orisan victory, this great thing called World Conquest, and that's like his great hall where he keeps all his poets. The 8 poets hold up the great hall and create this universe. So in architecture, like I wrote, it's just growing out of the empire. It's just part of the landscape, and it's the reflection of that splendor of what they believe themselves to be. So that was one thing. And then the other thing I wanted to say about the architecture, well, I don't know. That was it. I can't.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sinha, Ankita, Michelle, and others who have asked questions. I can't see anything else in the chat box. So I would like to sort of end this meeting today by thanking Dr. Reddy for once again being so generous and not only sharing his book PDF with me. I really liked reading the book, and once again I would like to recommend it to all of you, and also for agreeing to join on dialogues and talk about his book. And I thank you all for joining us and making this event a success. We hope to bring to you more such events in the near future. And I'm so happy that we are back so soon. Thank you very much.